Welcome to the EcoParent Podcast Network. I'm Sam, the founder of EcoParent magazine. My partner Alexis and I had zero experience in the publishing industry, no money, and a new baby. But we quit our jobs, leapt into the unknown, and started EcoParent magazine anyway. It was absolutely freaking terrifying. But at the same time, it felt right. Just a few years into the journey, Alexis was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer that later found its way to her brain. It was utter chaos, navigating treatment schedules, caring for a 3-year-old, and trying to run a fledgling business, not to mention the general emotional havoc. Alexis didn't make it, but the rest of us did, and I've spent the years since raising a wonderful son and building EcoParent into North America's top print magazine for conscientious families. Even 10 years in, we're still a very small crew. If you send an email, it's probably me that will answer you. And this podcast network is a monumental step for us, another leap into the unknown. But like before, it just feels right. And I know that Alexis would agree that the podcasting team I've assembled here is an incredible group of people whose only goal is to inspire the best in you. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and let you listen to the podcast. Thank you so much for stopping by. You're the reason we do what we do.
What is a teenager? This is Raising Greener Teens, and I am your host, Amanda Ofox Gillespie. On today's episode, we ask, what is a teenager? To help us get inside the teenage experience and really understand what's happening in the teenage brain and body, we have naturopathic doctor and teen advocate, Dr. Erin TeWinkel, joining us. In this episode, she explains what's happening in the teenage brain, how hormones aren't as much to blame as many of us think, and realistic ways that parents can help support the teenage years while also getting out of the way. If you also want your teenager to benefit from today's guests, stay tuned, and my teenager will teen-splain this episode in less than 2 minutes. Thanks for joining. Welcome, Dr. Erin TeWinkel. I'm really pleased to start off our series on raising greener teens with you. I was hoping we could begin today by learning all about you, who you are, and why. Why you have chosen, as you say, you're a doctor and a naturopathic doctor, but you also, what I really liked about your bio was that you call yourself a teen advocate. And I thought, if there's ever a group that needed an advocate, it's probably teenagers, perhaps the parents that are brave enough to go on the journey.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to sit down today and have this chat. So by trade, I'm a naturopathic doctor, and my focus is in teen health specifically. And I want to be an advocate for teens and their families. So it's the family environment. It's the parents and the teens. They need different things at different times, but it's a unit ideally. And the reason I became so passionate about this, and classic, it's always my own story, right? Like, my transition to adulthood. And I was, mid-20s, going to naturopathic college, and just young adulthood was hard for me. And I struggled with depression, and I struggled with an eating disorder. I struggled with not being able to feel connected to people. And I was just like, what's going on? And I was in medical school, so I had the opportunity to just dive into this. I just started looking backwards. Like, how did I get to here? And classically, like, I had a happy upbringing. I have 2 loving parents. We had all the basic needs. But when you start to look at the nitty gritty, it's like, where did we go wrong? It was more finer. And I realized it was in teenagehood. We have this idea, this narrative in our culture that teens are just hard and they're complicated and they're just teens, and let's just white knuckle it and get through this phase. Instead of, how can we thrive through this phase? The ability for parents to have awkward, weird, uncomfortable, curious conversations with their teens. And that's what was lacking in my home, was just like, we didn't talk about periods. We didn't talk about sex. We didn't talk about emotions. How are you feeling? We didn't check in. I didn't really get to develop my emotional IQ or just understanding my body or just having a space where I could just ask questions, because as you're going through this phase, there's a lot to learn and it's awkward and weird and uncomfortable. Your body's changing and you feel weird about things. You're not sure why. And that level of just like not knowing and not knowing who to talk to really is an area I wanted to focus on. How can I help those families have those weird, awkward conversations, but also understand, why is it weird? Why is it awkward? What's actually happening? Why do we care? And how can we thrive through adolescence to really help build and empower these amazing young humans who are going to change our world for the better?
I want all those things.
Right? Yes.
So let's start with perhaps the messiest of all questions, which is this idea of, what is a teenager? Mm-hmm. Is a teenager and the teenage brain, the teenage body, unique in some observable, knowable way?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, adolescence or teenagehood, this phase, which is long, it's from like 11-ish till about 25. And the biggest component of it, the reason all these weird, awkward things are happening, is mostly their brain change. It's one of the biggest developmental changes in your brain that a human ever goes through. Even more in depth than, like, we always talk about like that under 2, right? When you're a baby, your brain's growing, yes. But your brain is totally remapping and totally rebuilding itself bottom up. And that's actually one of the biggest myths with teens, is that hormones get blamed for a lot of things. Oh, it's their hormones. It's actually not. It's their brain development. I use a term from actually Dan Siegel. He has lots of great books on teenagehood, and he talks about the emotional spark, which I love, right? It's not moodiness or them being miserable. It's just they have this emotional spark. They have access to emotions and they really feel them. But because the way their brain's developing, like I said, it goes from bottom up. And what that means, at the bottom of your brain is the amygdala, which is all emotion. And it's fight or flight. It's very reaction. There's no logic or rationality to it. Raw emotion. And that's what gets kind of amped up first. So that's where they're coming from. Everything that's coming into them, around them, is going through that part of the brain first, not the logical prefrontal cortex. That doesn't get developed until mid-20s. So we, as the people and adults in their life, whether we're a parent, a caregiver, an aunt, uncle, a practitioner, we have this awesome opportunity to help their brain develop with lots of emotional intelligence and understanding, what do I do with these really big emotions and how do I maintain access to them and keep this emotional spark into adulthood? Because that's a big complaint for adults, is we lose the spark. My hope is that you can maintain it so you have this emotional like veracity as an adult too. There was a really good article, and we can link it in the show notes afterwards, that I refer to a lot, because this woman describes this interaction with her son and she just nailed it. He's about 12 or 13. And often with teenagers is you ask like, well, what do you want for dinner? But that question seems like you're asking something intense and you have this emotional outburst and you're like, I don't know where that came from. But when you ask them a question, they immediately, because they're going through that emotion state in their brain, they feel threatened. So they react as such. So it's just a moment to educate them. We talk a lot about puberty and your body's going to change, but we don't talk to them about how their brain's going to change. And so she took this moment with her son and said, yeah, I'm sorry. We talked about puberty and the changing of the body, but we never talked about your changing brain. And what's happening is you're having all these big emotions. You don't even know why. And he was like, yeah, you're right. You're right. I don't know sometimes why I snap or why I say something meaner than I intended to. And he's like, and then I feel bad about it, but it's awkward and I don't know what to do. So she was just saying, hey, this is what's happening. And they had this little joke of when she asked him a question and he has an intense reaction that is maybe more than is needed in that moment. They would teach each other, she's like, hey, I'm not a saber-toothed tiger. Because that's what's happening is like saber-toothed tiger, fight or flight, reaction state. But we're really just talking about like, what color of shirt do you want me to buy you, red or blue? Right? So understanding that little bit helps. And just telling, in my experience so far, talking to teens about that helps diffuse all of those, not all of them. It helps diffuse the interactions a little bit, right? It helps give them a little bit of knowledge like, oh, this is why I'm feeling so reactive, because they don't love feeling reactive or yelling or slamming the door. but that's where they're at because they don't know what else to do with it. So it's our responsibility as the adults in their lives to teach them, but we also have to learn it ourselves because we weren't taught this.
Okay, so I'm torn right now between asking about kind of the second stage, like when they get to the next stage, and just getting a few more tips. Because as a parent of teens, I have done a lot of brain research, so I know that it's normal. And nevertheless, as soon as you have someone screaming in your face because you asked them what they want for dinner, my response usually is just to kind of overreact in some way that is equally horrible, maybe probably a lot more horrible because I'm older and shouldn't go there. So I'm wondering, like, what are like the three things that families can do to sort of normalize that experience, but also to help bring it down?
First of all, in the moment when emotions elevate, your first goal, and sometimes we're not going to get it right because we're human and we're not going to get everything right, is to try and regulate yourself and to not be triggered, which is the hardest part. Don't react right away. If you even have to walk away, do that. Take time. Be like, I need to take a minute and call them on the behavior. Like, I don't find it appropriate that you're yelling at me right now. I'm just going to step away for a minute and we can finish this conversation. We both calm down. That's usually my go-to, is like, just take a pause. There's nothing wrong with taking a pause. You don't have to have the answer right away. You don't have to react right away. You don't have to do it right away. You can take time. So that helps you as the parent regulate. It's also modeling to them how to regulate your emotions, because that's what they're learning. Their brain hasn't figured that out yet. So the best thing you can do is model that. And on the flip side, in the moments when we don't take the pause and our emotions elevate too, and we also flip our lid, which is totally going to happen, it's still another learning opportunity, because then what you get to do is repair. Eventually you're going to calm down and then you're going to be like, oh, I did not like how I handled that situation. The best thing you can do is go back then and be like, I am sorry I yelled at you. In this family, we don't yell at each other, and I am sorry. Without saying, but you did this or blah, blah. Your reactions, your emotions, your responsibility. I'm sorry, because you genuinely are. And that also models to them that it's normal to make mistakes. We're all human. We're going to yell. We're going to get mad. We're going to lose our tempers sometimes. Totally normal. What we can do is we can repair, we can reconnect. That also, because their brain's developing, they're building those neural pathways. As we model it, as we go through it with them and demonstrate that, they're learning that. So by the time they are 25, they have fast access to that. And when they get to become a parent, if they choose to, they're going to have faster access than we even had as parents, to be able to be in that regulated state and take the breath and take the pause.
You said the teenage brain is developed from the bottom up. So what comes next? And is it like one day the amygdala is done and now they move to the next, or are like, when are you going to start seeing this kind of next phase come along?
Yeah. So in the early stages of adolescence, so like 12 to 16-ish, it is more amygdala based. Now, when we say, it doesn't mean they don't have access to any executive functioning, because obviously they still have a frontal lobe. It's just not fully online yet until really honestly about 24 to 25. But they can still practice it. It does take more concerted effort. It takes them seeing more people processing this. And what they don't have in their early teens is the ability to think like long-term consequences, right? And that's where as adults, we come in and we practice it with them. Actually, a really great example for teens is, decision-making and when they're in the face of peer pressure. It's normal for them too, as teens, to care and want to get advice and support from peers, not their parents, because that's them practicing being independent. So as teens, they're practicing finding their own people. Who else can I talk to? Who else can I trust? Who else can I get information for? They genuinely care more about what their peers think and do and say and the advice that they have to give. So you can help them practice that literally by role playing. Whether it's drugs or drinking or just an activity that as a family, that's not part of your values, right? And each family gets to decide what they're comfortable with and what they're not. Role play it with them. What are you going to say? How are you going to react if I'm pressuring you? Because in the moment, their brain is very dopamine sensitive. It loves novelty. It loves new things. They care about what their friends are doing and saying. So they need practice to prep for that interaction. And by doing that, you're also prepping the neural pathways, and they're learning that process of higher executive functioning of like, what are the consequences? Like you have to lay it out. Hey, if you drive really fast and you get into an accident, like let's talk this through before you're in the driver's seat. Or even for yourself, if you're trying to make a decision, talk it out loud. If you're planning a trip or you're doing something like, oh, if I have to do this, then this, and this will happen. Let them go through problem solving with you. It just has to be a much more intentional process because it's not their go-to default setting yet.
You know how you talked about that initial response in teenagers that can often be very dramatic. You called it the saber-toothed tiger, or like, responding as if the parent often is the saber-toothed tiger. I feel like in my teenagers or preteens, I have these two examples. One, which is more likely to respond really big and out. And the other one, everything goes in and retreats. And so you sort of talked about the fight or flight. So I think I have two like very full on examples of each. And because I am and was more of the fight person, I understand, even though that's really hard to deal with, I see that and kind of understand it more. With the flight or the kind of retreat response, I find that hard. And as you're talking here about these tools, like talk it out or say, I'm not a saber-toothed tiger, so much harder to say that to a kid who's just sort of like, walks away, goes into the room, closes the door, and you can hear them bawling, on the other side of it. So what are some tools that you've seen for that kind of response?
And I'm so glad you brought that up because we often end up focusing on the explosive because it's more obvious. That sometimes has longer term consequences because at least the fighter is having the release and it's more obvious. So you're dealing with it. It is important to be more mindful of those kids who are more likely to retreat. And often they're labeled the good kid. They're so easy. It's because they're internalizing it. Still making a point to check in. Be like, okay, I saw we had this interaction and then you left and were quiet for a bit. When are you ready to talk about this? Can we process it? What was going on? And really reminding that good kid that no matter what they say or what their feelings are, like you've got them. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I need you to know if what I said or what I did triggered you in some way, right? Like you really need to be more intentional about creating this space that they're going to be comfortable talking to you in. And one actually helpful tool is making sure that you have some kind of habitual or ritual time where that good kid gets time with their caregiver in a one-on-one fashion somewhat regularly. Whether it's, on Saturday mornings, we always go to the cafe and get a tea, or maybe you drive them to one of their extracurriculars, OAs. Some moment weekly, ideally, or whatever fits in your schedule where they have time with you, even if it ends up being quiet most of the time. But they know that space exists and it's always there and it's accessible. Because if you'll notice, even a lot of kids, it's always before bed. In the evening, they're quieted down, they're in bed, and they'll be like, oh, hey, parent or caregiver, and they start to talk. Even though you're tired and it's 11 p.m., like, oh my God, please take advantage of those moments where they're telling you something, anything. And then the best thing you can do is do not solve the problem. Just listen. It's the hardest thing. You want to be like, I have the experience. I've got you. Just do this. No, that they will immediately shut down more. You just want to acknowledge like, oh, that does suck that your teacher was doing that. Ugh, that's it. Just let them talk, especially those good quiet kids. Because as soon as you jump in with like, I'm going to fix it, then they retreat more. So it's making opportunity where they have space to talk. And then when they do talk, say nothing. Or if you're having a really hard time, you can ask them, do you want me to help you with this problem? And start to open that conversation. But ask them first. Once that ritual space is there for that good, quiet kid who's not having the blow-ups, then they will have the space to talk to you and they will get used to having that also released, but in a different way for them.
I need a little role playing here because I need to change this. I see. One of my daughters says to me, oh, none of my friends will go into the hot tub without wearing their clothes because they're embarrassed of their bodies, but they're not allowed to go into the hot tub with their clothes on. So I, of course, immediately say some really smart advice about, oh, how sad it is that they're so embarrassed of their bodies. And as you get older, it just gets harder to love yourself. And do you think any of this has been affected by social media? So could you and I do this? Like, if I come to you and, I'm making dinner, I'm looking in the fridge and I'm like, Mom, it's really sad. I've noticed my guy friends, none of them will get in the hot tub because they're embarrassed unless they are wearing their clothes.
Yeah, that's weird. Do you want help on this? Like strategize how you could encourage them to get in the hot tub, or are you just venting?
Yeah, I don't want your help.
But yeah, just be like, I feel like that's super annoying. Like what a bummer for them that they don't get to enjoy the hot tub. Especially when it comes to like body image stuff. Oh my gosh, my claws are up because I'm like, I want every person to love their body and be able to go and enjoy going in a hot tub. But that's not the time and the place. But I promise you this, if you give them that space, they will keep talking to you about it and you will get the opportunity to eventually share those amazing tidbits of life experience. But they have to ask for it and be open to it. You can't just give it, which is the hardest part.
So that must be very challenging for you as a clinician, because if a person's coming in, a teenager is coming in and bringing those things up in their small amount of time with you, isn't that like inviting you to comment on it?
It is. So I will say I have the absolute luxury that I am not these teens' parent. So they do want my advice in a different way than they want their parents' advice. It's funny, is one of the most common things that happens after like the first even appointment or two is the parents are like, I told them that before. And when you told it to them, it was like they'd never heard it. And it's so frustrating. And so now I forewarn parents, like, just so you know, I'm going to tell them things that you've already told them about social media, about nutrition, about sleep, but they're going to hear it differently from me. And they're going to come to you and be like, oh, guess what Dr. TeWinkel said? La, 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 la. I'm going to do this thing. And you'll be like, oh my God, I told you that 100 times. But this is why it's also important that teens have other trusted adults or mentors in their life, because it's totally normal for them to ignore advice from their parents because they're practicing getting other sources of information. So whether it's a coach or a healthcare practitioner or an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, someone as a family that you trust has the values that they're going to share similarly to your family values that they can go to with the questions that they don't want to talk to you about. It's important to try to build that in as best you can.
Okay, so we're talking about, is there a sort of, definition for what is a teenager? I feel like I want to say, well, I know it when I see it with teenagers. But you're helping to actually break it down. I know from my research and writing is much more about like pregnancy and early parenthood, where there's also a huge brain growth for women and even men going through that close familial experience. And I'm just sort of guessing that some of that same stuff is happening in teenagers because we know that they have hormonal stuff going on. So can you tell us a little bit more about what is going on hormonally and what the reasons for that?
Yeah. So what's interesting, and again, like that's one of the common myths, is we assume all of the essence of adolescence is hormones, but it's actually mostly brain changes. Now, yes, there is hormones happening, so it's also happening at the same time, right? As they're approaching adolescence, they're hitting puberty. So really though, what those hormones are doing and what their goal is actually is the physiological changes. So we see hair growth, we see breast development. Those are happening for people with uteruses, right? They might start menstruating and they're ovulating now. For, the people with testicles, their sperm production's happening. Like those hormones are literally focusing on that. Really, it's like gonadal development, right? Ovaries are being developed, testes are being developed. And then more so in the menstruators, there is more of an impact on their not their brain development per se, but their emotional spark. Periods have this whole other impact. That hormone profile of menstruators does change over the course of like 20 to 32 days, right? And we have different phases of that cycle. And during that cycle, we have access to different abilities. So there is that piece, but it's not, from my knowledge so far, like specifically changing the way our brain is developing. The hormones are really more the physical changes that are happening.
So all this is happening. Can we do as far as nutrition, healthy practices, whatever, to support the body as it is trying to create this future adult?
Right? So yeah, there's huge growth happening. So foundational health pieces are important. Sleep, nutrition, movement, enjoyment, play, pleasure. Like there's all these foundations of health that are really important in encouraging that to happen. And a lot of times, like I would say parents mostly come in because they are worried about the nutrition aspect. And I will say I'm very conscientious about how I talk about food with teens, because food can be fuel, but I really don't want to get into this good versus bad food, because that sets them up for a challenging relationship with food for the rest of their life, right? And it's easy because we want the healthiest, we want the best. But as soon as we start dividing this good versus bad food, then the bad food actually becomes more desirable because it's you can't have it. And from a teen brain perspective, as soon as we say no, you can't have it, well, they want it more. Also, their brain is very dopamine sensitive. So it loves novelty, it loves new things. And they're not in the position yet where they're really thinking like long-term health, long-term foot. So as parents, we're like, well, we know long-term, we want them to have a good nutritional standpoint. We care about vitamins, we care about minerals, we care about enough protein, all of these things. Teens don't care about that long-term goal. So you have to meet them where they're at. And oftentimes, like what a parent wants and what needs to know for a teen is very different from what a teen wants and needs to know as a teen. When I talk to teens about food, we do talk about, okay, what's going on in your life? It has to apply to them in the moment. The easiest example is like kids who are into sports or athletics, because it's more obvious from like we can measure that performance. And usually the very first thing is, if you're not performing well, they're usually underfueled. I would say in general, teens just aren't getting enough food and enough protein, because the parents are still usually in control at that point of like what food is accessible in the home, right? So the parents' responsibility there is like stocking the cupboards in the fridge with lots of food that the kid likes too, right? So trying to have that conversation of what do they like, and then having the conversation, which is usually where I step in, is like, why do they care about what they're picking and choosing to eat? If you have a teen who's menstruating, if they're underfueled, not getting enough, their cycle will be more irregular. If they're eating more processed foods and less nutrient dense foods, they're going to have more painful periods, right? So we can talk about that to them as like, where in their life right now as teens is nutrition impactful, right? Also from like a school performance, like because the way teens' brains are developing, they love staying up late. Like their melatonin in the brain doesn't even come up to a high enough level for bedtime till like midnight. And then they need about 10 hours of sleep ideally, so they wouldn't be up till 10 a.m. That's, if we were left to their natural devices, that's their flow of sleep and wake. But our school system starts at 8 a.m. in some places. So it's very challenging. So they're often not hungry in the morning because their body is still like, I need to be sleeping. So getting them to fuel for breakfast becomes challenging. And they're noticing, man, my first class is so hard to get through. I can't focus. I can't pay attention. So even having that conversation of like, okay, usually I'm all about honoring your hunger, honoring your fullness, listening to your body cues. But we also have to understand that our system is pushing you out of your physiological norm, and you need breakfast to function at school. So sometimes just pointing that out to them, like, if you eat at breakfast, you'll feel better in your first class. I like to keep it as simple as possible. It's like, you need protein, you need fruits and vegetables, you need carbohydrates, and you want all of those at each meal, if you can. Do I care which carb? No. Do I care which protein? No. Do I care which fruits and vegetables you like? No. But I often talk about like a pie plate. Half the plate you want to be fruit and vegetables, a quarter you want protein, and a quarter you want to be grains and carbohydrates. That's a well balance. That's giving you vitamins, minerals, all of the things that you need to grow. So it's finding what the teen is struggling with and attaching how important nutrition is to that thing that they care about.
Okay, so this, of course, takes me to lots of other questions because, like, in our family, good food is a major value because I've spent years researching health and and environment and all those things. Like, I probably care too much about it for what is really ideal for my teen relationship or my relationship with a teen. Walk through about how much parents should make a big deal of when their kids, to use an example that one of my friend gave, I live in the middle of nowhere, so we don't have this particular example, but my friend's kid every day on their way home from school would stop by and get one of those packages of like Mr. Noodles, MSG laden, cheap carb kind of thing, not because they needed it. It was definitely not in this family's kind of values around their food. And every single day the kid did it. There was a lot of going back and forth about how upsetting this was to the parent. So how much do you just let it go versus how much do you kind of harp on and on, as I might, about why it's not healthy?
So it's a really important practice to let a lot of it go. There's a lot of food out there. We could go through how to measure quantity and quality and blah, 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 blah. But for a teen, they're experimenting and we want them to experiment. They're curious. And the only way they're really going to know how they feel from eating certain foods is if we let them experiment. And the only thing we check in on them with is like, how are they feeling? How's your energy? Right? And then maybe they'll be willing to have a discussion of like, well, maybe if we tried a different food option, would you feel better? Also, they're super resilient and they can get away with eating whatever and still grow and be great also. And giving them their body's amazing ability that honestly they can survive off of like maybe what we wouldn't think is the most ideal and they'll be great. But as soon as we make it a problem, they're just going to want it more. And then it becomes this control struggle. We don't want food to become a place where they're going to try to control and struggle over. Model it. Not by saying it. What are you doing as a parent and what are you putting on your plate? And what kind of, like what dinner? For the most part, at dinner time, ideally you're having some dinners as a family. So you get control over that meal. As the parent, your line of responsibility is you're providing the food. Their responsibility is if they eat it and how much. We're not negotiating or having discussions over, well, you have to eat this, then that, or so much of this. You make the food and then the rest is up to them. But you're modeling what's on your plate and your eating habits. And then you can make comments of like, oh man, I haven't had a salad in a few days and maybe my bowel movements aren't functioning or I don't feel good or I don't have energy. But that's what matters, right? Is like how you're feeling and how that food impacts you. And you get to talk about your experience, but let them experiment and figure out that experience on their own. And really the goal is that they have a long-term healthy relationship with food. And I talk a lot about like even intuitive eating is this whole like principles of like making peace with food and actually being able to be intuitive and make choices that are good for your body without having these restrictions and this is good and this is bad and you can never have this and only have this and always wading through what our culture says is good and bad in the moment. Teaching them that they can listen to themselves and trust themselves and modeling the behaviors that as a person you value. That eating a well-balanced whole foods diet is and does have health benefits, but you can't force it on them. You can only model it.
I just think like how much advice of having a 2-year-old actually is helpful with teenagers, right? Or like, it's like anything that you allow to be a battle will be a battle. So, and I feel really grateful that I spent all those years up to the kind of preteen years having such healthy, diverse meals.
Yeah. And I would say too, and this is like, I truly, truly like in my soul know that if you give them the foundations young, through their teenage years, they love experimenting. They love novelty. That is what they are supposed to do, is try things out. And they might only want to eat fast food options for years. You're not buying it for them, and that's not what's in your house, but they're going to do it. They're going to have their own spending money. They're going to go out. They're going to go with their friends. Let it happen. It's an experiment. I know that by the time they are coming into adulthood, they will go back to the foundations you gave them because it feels better. But we have to empower them to know and let them know that they know when they feel better. We can't tell them. No one else can tell them. They know, they have it in them intuitively, that they will eventually be driven to eat more nutrient-dense things that make them feel better. But they need that experimentation time to figure it out.
So talking about some of the other things that are, kind of equally complex, I guess, the importance of sleep and how deeply our society seems to conflict with what the teenagers actually need. And, there's all this kind of sleep research, right? The sleep research says wake up every day at the same time. The sleep research says really try to create space so that you can have good sleep, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Don't eat before sleep, all these things. And then you have your teenager, right, who you're forcing to wake up some amount of times during the week, usually well before 7 so that they can get to school. And then you have the days where they do not go to school.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do you let them sleep all day?
Yes. This is the thing. Yes. And it depends. And this also, it always depends on your teen. And each teen is very different. And if they're really struggling with sleep and they're like in insomnia, that would be a whole different kettle of fish. But if you have the teen who, for the most part, they fall asleep easy, they stay asleep until you have to wake them up at whatever time, chances are during the week, especially if they're involved in any extracurricular, there literally isn't enough time in the day based on their scheduling for them to get 9 to 10 hours of sleep. It is not possible. I know, like swimmers, for example, they're up, they have to be at the pool by 5 a.m. They swim before school, they go to school, sometimes they swim after school, they go home, they have dinner, they have 3 hours of homework, they're in bed by 10. There's no wiggle room. So yes, on the weekends when you can get more sleep, get more sleep. If you have to have a nap in the afternoon for like 45 minutes, as long as it's not disrupting you getting to bed when you can get to bed, please do it. Because chronically, I would say in this society, our teens are underslept. So if they can catch up, not that you can technically really catch up on sleep, but they're growing, they need more sleep and rest. And if they have the opportunity, let them. Now, I would say that one caveat is if you're noticing all of a sudden your teen is in bed more, withdrawing more, sleeping longer, not engaging, you also want to be paying attention, like, is it depression? Is there something else going on? Where all of a sudden there's this weird change where they're just really withdrawing and going to sleep a lot more than normal. I would say pay attention to that. But yeah, if it's a Sunday and they don't have any plans and they just want to sleep in till 11 or noon, like let them sleep in.
Perfect. My kids are going to love you. Okay, so one of the other things you talked about is movement, and we have no organized sports. We don't have a high school. We have, barely anything for the youth. What are recommendations? Because, I guess I should also stop and say what I see on the other hand are friends and acquaintances that I have whose youth are deeply involved perhaps in sports to the point where maybe they're even going the other way, right? Where their life is just, given over by their commitment to their wrestling team or to hockey or.
Totally. And again, it's a nuanced conversation because what often happens in our culture is movement is equated with changing your body. Movement has nothing to do with the body that you're in or the size or shape or anything. We care about movement for so many other reasons, right? It helps your mental health. We know there's like cardiovascular, metabolic benefits. Like there's lots of benefits of movement, and our human body is meant to move. Also, cognitively, we cannot learn as well when we're being still all the time, right? So first, it's help pointing that out. Like being still isn't great, and you probably notice you have like after 30 minutes even of sitting in class trying to learn something new, you're maxing out. Even if it's just getting up to stretch. Movement can be anything. It can be standing, it can be stretching, it can be just going for a walk, it can be taking the trash out, it can be gardening. It doesn't have to be you have to go to a gym and exercise or do this activity or be involved in extracurricular. But it's important that your body isn't just sedentary all the time. So if you want to talk to your friends, can you do a walking phone call or walking FaceTime or walking Snapchat, whatever you're doing? Can you add in movement somehow? And then do you notice that you feel better? Really trying to draw this line of like, How does movement impact your emotional state? Does it help you flip your lid less? Are you better at your sport when you have like just other regular movement? How is studying and schoolwork going when you're getting in some regular movement, right? Are your relationships easier because you're moving regularly? You're not having these outbursts as much. Like pointing out those important factors really help. On the other side, where, we're worried about like, are they overscheduled? Are they doing too much? That's where you really have to check in and be like, do they love it? Long as they love it and they're feeling nourished and they're feeling excited and passionate about it, then why wouldn't we want to encourage them to follow that? But also being mindful, like, what's your health doing? Is there a health issue we're dealing with because you're doing too much? How do we find that balance for you? And because they're young and vital, they can definitely push way harder than we can because they have that capacity, right? They have that bandwidth. But just talking about noticing, hey, if you're more irritable or you're feeling your mood's more fluctuating, are you overscheduled? Do you need a bit more rest? Do you need to take a pause? Bringing about that self-awareness for themselves and just like actual self-care and teaching them that. But we also be modeling it. As a parent, what are you modeling? Are you active? Do you move your body? And do you move your body because you feel better? Or are you moving your body because you went out for a burger and fries? Or, I have to run off that cake, right? Then we're getting into this really awkward position of like movement, again, is a punishment. So being really aware of how you're even talking about movement in your household for yourself, because it is important that they move. If they're just sitting all the time, it's not great. But also what I honestly see in practice is when teens are told to move out of worry their body's changing and sets them up for eating disorders and body dysmorphia. And then they don't want to move because it feels like a punishment or because something has to change.
I really appreciate that advice because I definitely have found in my life, particularly for a number of years, my kids were homeschooled. And so I'd be like, and now you must go outside and do your activity time, instead of it being organic or doing, when you're at school, you have the benefit of like recess. And so you kind of have modeling of kids who find that fun. And I found that when my kids experienced school, that they moved a lot versus at home. I have girls, not boys. They would kind of just sit around when left to it, or maybe they would come along with mama, on a walk because they had to. So just that sort of joyous aspect I really appreciate, and which gets me to one of the other things you mentioned, which is the importance on our body and minds of play, of enjoyment. And I find that to be kind of extra challenging in the world these days where so much of enjoyment and play has to do with devices. Can you talk about things that you've seen about how families or teens are finding enjoyment in play in a variety of ways?
It is trickier because like everyone is on a device, and we also have to be prepared and allow that some of the device activities are still fun and play. Maybe not in a physical nature, but they are still getting pleasure and connection and fun. Are we used to it? No. Is it something new? Yes. But can it still have a lot of positive impact? Also, yes. Do we need to understand the boundaries with it? Yes. Do we need to help our teens navigate that? Yes. Because like social media, for example, lots of benefits if we're teaching them the benefits and becoming aware. Like you can build a news feed or whatever you're scrolling with positive, motivational people that inspire you, and you can connect with friends and like engage on it in a meaningful way. You can also get sucked in self-comparison, body comparison, negativity, cyberbullying, but we have to be having these conversations. And the way I phrase it often is like, I talk about privilege and responsibility. So having this device, having this access is a very big privilege. It comes with these responsibilities. We care about sleep. If you're on your phone till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, that you are not showing responsibility for yourself, for your body. So then you might have to lose that privilege. And really being clear as a family and as boundaries and as your values, like, okay, what are the responsibilities that you have to show to get this privilege? Because it is a privilege. And I want them to have it because that's how their friends are communicating. But how can we be mindful about it? And how can we make sure it is a source of a positive social engagement, and they have access to information. But then on the flip side, we have to teach them to be critically aware of the information they're taking in. Like body image is a great example of being aware of like most feeds, if they're body focused, are a specific body type. They're also oftentimes photoshopped and not real, but it's still something you have to make them aware of. And like you can be in the store, in the line at the grocery store, being like, interesting about all these magazines, how they only show one specific type of body type. Like all the people literally are basically the same. But when we look around in real life, all of us are so different and varied. Pointing that out, that this is not something you need to strive for, right? And just really helping them become aware of what they are digesting. And that just like food that we digest that makes us feel good or bad, social media is another thing that we digest and can make us feel good or bad. Also pointing out like the way these platforms work is they're using your psychology against you. Teens' brains love dopamine. They love novelty. They love new. So this whole idea of like they're fast and it's always new, that lights up your brain and it wants more. Those companies use that to their advantage to keep you on the platform longer, and they profit off of that. And telling them like, you have to be aware, like, do you need to set time limits? And the teens I work with, they will, because they get it, and they'll set up their own boundary. And as the parents also, like, you're paying for it typically. You do have some control, and you get to decide as a family unit, these are the boundaries we're setting. You know, there's no phones at the dinner table. There's no phones after 10 p.m. Like, and I do encourage those strict boundaries until they're like older and they've really shown that they can handle this privilege. The people who have teens right now did not grow up with social media. So the parents and the teens are learning this at the same time. Like, let's go through this together and just checking in like, oh, how is it going for you? Like, has weird things happened? Has there been bullying? And also like when you post something, I have like a couple of worksheets I do, and like just a few questions I make them ask. If you're going to post something, is it a true representation of yourself and who you authentically are? They just need these prompts. Always take 5 seconds before you post something and just go through this. Or if you're making a comment, is that a comment you would want to receive? And then you can have a healthy relationship with social media, and you can feel great using it.
Okay, so I feel like you've taken us through this process of both hormonally and brain-wise, what is a teenager and how we can support a teenager. Talk a little bit about the changing idea of normal. You know, to the extent that there was ever normal, I think we've broken that open quite a bit, which I think is one of the great things about being alive today, is that we understand that normal is a huge spectrum with every possible representation on it. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you see for teenagers with learning disorders, neurological differences in how they relate or kind of represent in the world? How you find their brain development and self-development is similar, different, needs different kinds of support?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many ways we go with this, but the very first foremost thing is, like we said, there's neurodiversity. Everyone learns a different way, thinks in a different way, has thought processes in a different way. Like, yes, there's this baseline development in the brain happening. It's going to happen at different rates. It's going to happen in different ways. Some people's brains are just going to function differently, and that's cool. And keeping that mindset of curiosity and really being like, well, how do I learn best? How do I think? As caregivers, as parents, as people in teens' lives, we can be an advocate for them to not try and stuff themselves into a box that they don't fit in. And being like, it's okay to question the status quo. And actually, teens, that's one of their superpowers, is that they love questioning the status quo. They want to test the boundaries. Right? So encouraging that, especially if there's like learning difficulty in school, or, you know, they're just picking up like, hey, I'm not processing things the same way as like my friend is or my peer is. First, like, that's okay. And that's totally normal. There's nothing wrong. Nothing's broken. You don't need to be fixed. So changing that narrative of like, we need diagnosis so that we can fix you. No, you don't need to fit into a box, but we need to support you in the system that we're living in. But they need so much advocacy to support them. We should link her in the show notes. I've actually been recently talking to this woman, Lauren is her name, and she has this company called The Learning Pirate. And this is her whole focus, is like actually helping people learn, right? And that we're all different and we all have different access to different things. So just supporting the individual and knowing that they don't have to fit into a box just because your teacher is teaching you one way or that someone is saying be like this, but that just doesn't intuitively jive, right? So we're teaching them to learn to be comfortable in their own skin and who they are and how can we help you. But also looking like, at your foundations. Are you sleeping? Are you like getting proper nutrition? Are you moving your body? What are your hormones doing? Like if you're a menstrual, like are you having a regular period? Like there's things we can look at too from an underlying foundational health perspective that will impact cognition and executive function and like how you're participating in society. But if all of those are like functioning, then we have to work with you as a neurodiverse individual and help support you.
I feel like there were so many quotable things in that little response, so thank you. Okay, so now maybe the things that are the scariest part of being a parent to a teenager right now. What about social media, porn, sex, drugs, alcohol, and what we know about their effects on the teenage brain versus the sort of need to not overly stigmatize or taboo something because of the kind of need for novelty and sometimes even opposition. So
yeah,
how do we balance it?
It's totally tricky. So it's always just, and I always say this, like having the awkward conversations. Even like porn, for example, like we talked about that earlier, it's just like, yes, the world of internet exists and your young preteens are going to Google penis or vagina or breast. Like they just are. So before they're actually preteens, you need to be having this conversation on the internet. There's lots of stuff. Not all of it is real. These are things that you might come upon. It's totally normal and okay to be curious. And of course, you're curious what other bodies look like. And they're coming into this phase where their bodies are changing, hormones are changing, their sexuality might be appearing more in a different way. It can be scary for them. So we need to have the conversation to set them up that they're going to see things. And it opens the conversation that they can come to you with weird, awkward things, and they're not going to be in trouble because they found a naked video online. So first we need to set that stage of like, nope, this is a safe space. We can talk about these weird, awkward things. And then you need to have the conversation of like, especially when it comes to like porn on the internet, it's like, that's not real. Those are actors. That is not the expectation. Oftentimes they're more derogatory against the female in that instance. So just letting them know that those aren't real expectations of like intimacy or what sex actually is. Getting ready to have those really weird, awkward conversations. And earlier we said, you can take a pause. If your kid comes to you and has sex questions, or I saw this weird thing on social media, you don't have to answer them immediately. You can be like, you know what? Can you just give me a day and can we talk about this tomorrow afternoon? And you can go collect yourself. You can grab some resources. You can think about, okay, what's the message we want to relay? Take time. I find so often in this world, we quickly think we have to have the answers immediately because that's what we're used to. I'll Google it. I'll find it. But we can take time. You can look for other people to pull in information, be like, I don't know how to handle this conversation, right? Like call on the village. But the biggest thing we can do to tackle dealing with this access to like all information, real or not real, is just being willing and having the space to hold conversations that maybe you don't even know how to have, but just be willing to start somewhere and make it okay to ask questions and not be ashamed. And you're always going to be curious. That's totally normal. And if you're not comfortable talking to me, can we find someone you're comfortable talking to? Because I want you to be supported through this. And I don't want you to be left alone in the dark world of the internet, right? Like I want you to have someone to guide you through this.
I have found with a lot of these questions, this is where I'm particularly happy to have community and friends who have teenagers or young adults who are at the next stage, right? Where I can see, oh, look at, here's how you can survive really difficult things. Because for some reason, despite all my research, I find it hard to imagine the future, right? Like, oh my God, if my kids ever, right? Like how many times do you think that if my kids ever? And then you get there and you're like, oh yeah, of course, my kids will. And then you need to, for me, it's very helpful to kind of get normalized for my own self with other parents. Like, okay, well, how did they do this? I just still want to believe we can live in a world where kids aren't going to have to deal with porn, sex, drugs, alcohol, and social media until they're full-blown adults. But that doesn't seem to be the world that we live in. So I'm wondering what you see out there as supportive communities for where parents are able to get kind of peer advice like that and peer modeling.
In today's world of like podcasts, there's tons like this was an example. Like there's also, I know it seems old school now, but like for parents, Facebook groups, there's a few that are just for like parenting teens. And you have thousands of people in a group of all over the world of different backgrounds, cultures, experiences, where you can ask a question and people can give their advice. So we do, on the flip side, because of the internet and social media, we also have access to information. And what I always encourage people to do is, you're overwhelmed sometimes by the resources and you want the answer. Where's the book that has the answer that tells me exactly what to do? That doesn't actually exist. So being comfortable following your own intuition as a parent, so you can take on information and be like, what actually resonates with me and feels right, and trusting your gut. I feel like that's almost been trained out of us because we need to find the resource, we need to find the expert, we need to find the answer. And yes, it's important to call in community and ask for help. But at the end of the day, you have to know where it resonates with you and your kid. You know your teen. Right? You feel like you don't because they're becoming a different person, but like you know them. And also, you can try something and it might not work, and that's also okay. And that can be another learning opportunity. Hey, we tried this thing. It totally blew up on our face. Can we try something else? Because that's also real life. There's lots of solutions to one problem. It's not a one size fits all. There's no right or wrong. It's just like we're trying. We're showing up with an intention that we want a positive outcome. This is the outcome we're going for. But there's a lot of ways we can do it. And how are we going to do it where we're all feeling good about it?
I feel like we could, if people listen to nothing else, that's the takeaway. And it's the hardest thing about being a parent, I have found from the beginning, is you never have cared about anything or anyone else as much as you care about this. And at the same time, you are practicing for the first time, perhaps, learning what it means to really be the expert, like to not give away your power, but to take it on. And so this kind of comes back to what I really find that you're reminding me of is this is the greatest gift we can give our teenagers. Like I struggle because I want to give them often too much information or too much, reason ability. But really what I hear you saying is we're giving them the gift of helping them learn the first steps of what will then one day make them great adults and great parents, which is just to explore into that curiosity and to the living process of being your own expert on your own body, self-life. So I feel pretty excited about that. Before we get to the actual ending, though, can you give us some signposts or guideposts to look for when you feel like things really have gone off the rails? So addictive behavior or depressive behavior, what does it start looking like? What do you look for and say, oh, okay, now we are no longer in the realm of healthy kind of exploration?
So that is when you immediately do need to find actual support. Even if it's your pediatrician, your GP, anybody, an emergency room visit, just some way to get in the door. So the first signs are like, there's really intense withdrawal and they're not engaging in their activities they usually engage in, or they're all of a sudden change friend groups and they're very different friend groups than what they always had hung out with, right? And they won't really explain why. And this is going back to what we just said, the intuition. You will know as a parent when something is off. You will know when it's not just teenageness and it's something more intense. Even if you're wrong and it's just them being a teenager, it's always good in that no one's ever going to regret bringing your teenager to a therapist or a doctor or getting it assessed. You're never going to regret that. You will regret not getting it assessed. So if you have any inkling or any concern or worry that you're worried about depression or self-harm or addiction, then you do need to call in experts who focus on that thing specifically, right? And that's where our fabulous Google comes in handy, and you Google it and what's in my local community, what community health centers do we have access to, what mental health support systems do we have. I live in a community where I know there's access. Not all people have that community, which is where if you do have access to internet, you can find online communities, and telemedicine is a thing now, right? So you don't have to be in close to a doctor's office. There's lots of even mental health apps where you can get access to a therapist again, if you have access to the phone or internet, or even if you have access to a local library that has internet you can use, like we can find access to things now and really trust your knowing as a parent that like, this just isn't sitting right with me. Or I don't know how to break through. I don't even know how to check in with them. They're just not responding to me. Check in with yourself, but like, am I giving them too much information? Am I listening? Like all the things we kind of touched on. And if you're doing those things and there's just like nothing, then yeah, you need to go to your doctor's office, step one. But really just like trusting your gut that when you think you need more than what you can handle. And sometimes what you also do is if the teen is totally resistant to going to see a practitioner or a therapist or whatever, you as the parent can go and get support. This is what's happening. Walk me through it. What do I need to say? What do I need to do? Right? You as the parent, if the teen isn't willing to engage, you can get support. You can get tools. You can, be mindful of what's going on, and you can learn and grow as a parent of like, okay, how do I keep them safe? Right? When we're talking about those more extremes, we're just like ultimate, like, how am I keeping them safe? And what kind of things can we put in place from a safety perspective first? Like, let's get up this acute, scary situation. If that's what we're worried about, like from an addictions perspective, like what do we do? And being mindful. I would say on the addictions thing, what I've seen actually in practice is and it's less now because we're more aware, but if your kid or a young person has to go through any like surgery or injury, be really mindful about the pain meds that get prescribed. That would be my one word of warning, as that's usually how it starts. And, checking in, like teens also experience grief and loss, or their friend, something happened to their friend, and really giving them support on those fronts so they're not going down a road where they're left alone without support.
Okay, so I feel like people are going to want to know now, what about if they want you as one of their supports or want to learn more about you? And tell us about your website and what kind of things do you offer for people who might be anywhere in the world?
Yes. So as a naturopath, I can only see people who live in Ontario. I do virtual. I mean, if you happen to live in my geographical location, I can see you in person, but I do actually mostly virtual across Ontario. And that's like one-on-one private healthcare. And that's all on my website, which we're going to link in the show notes. And it has information about how to book and all of that kind of stuff. From a more global position, there's two programs I offer. One's for teens, it's for women. So typically that'd be the mother or an aunt or someone. But for the teen, again, this is all woman identifying people. So I have one program called the Teen Collective that I co-run with another woman who's a teen and health advocate. And right now also it's virtual because of COVID. It's kind of pushed everything virtually. And basically those programs are designed to anyone in the world. And we just talk to teens about the stuff we talked about. Self-care, how to deal with stress, nutrition, movement, but from an empowering perspective of like, how can we talk with this in a health promoting way? Like how to deal with social media, how to deal with like how you're making connections, friendships, social interactions, like all of that periods, like the nuts and bolts of like becoming an adolescent, but they get to learn it from us who aren't parents. We're just going to be the cool mentors in their life, right? So it's a different environment and they're learning it with their peers. But on the flip side, I also am a Wild Collective facilitator. So that's for women or women identified folks. And it's a 10-month program. I usually run it once a year. We meet once a month and we go through all of these from a foundational perspective, like thyroid health, menstrual health, and we just get to the nitty gritty of like underlying health aspects. And then how do we have these conversations with our spouses, with our kids, with our partners, with our friends, and really just helping people advocate for themselves, trusting their intuition. How do I feel about stuff? How do I process this? And just giving people tools to know themselves and be a powerful advocate for themselves and for the people they love. So on my website, all the information's there. And then also, I mean, they can, on Instagram is where I usually hang out the most in terms of like sharing stuff like this and like posting about it or doing lives and just talking about all like the 100 things we covered in like more micro doses. It's at Dr. TeWinkel. And again, we'll link it in the show notes, but that's kind of where you can get the faster, quicker tidbits, so to speak.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been I feel like both very strategic, but also very hopeful session today. So thank you for sharing your expertise, but also your positive attitude about that. I both feel more excited about the prospect of parenting my teen as well as more empowered.
Yes, awesome. I love teens. I want to leave with one quote. There's this woman, Lisa D'Amour, and she has these amazing books about adolescence. And here it is. We make raising a teenage sound like a roller coaster ride. The whole family hops on, white knuckles their way through, and the parents hope that after all the ups and downs, their teen steps off at the end as a healthy, happy adult. That's the narrative that's been told before, but we want to change that and be like, no, you don't need to white knuckle. You can hop on the roller coaster, throw your hands up, enjoy the ups and downs, and thrive and know that your kid is hopping off the roller coaster as a healthy, happy adult. That's the goal.
I love it. Thank you so much for sharing those last words and for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Hi, Zella. Thanks for being here to teen-splain this episode for us.
Yeah, of course.
What stood out to you in this interview with Dr. Erin TeWinkel, Zella?
I really liked how she focused on the teenage brain and how it's going through so much development. How she talked about the growth starts at the bottom of your brain, which is the emotional part of your brain. And that's why teenagers can have really big responses and sometimes overreact to really small things.
And what were some of the takeaways that parents hopefully got from this from a teenage perspective?
That they need to let go a little bit, step back, and kind of just take it easy for themselves and their teenager.
Thanks, Zella. Well done.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Raising Greener Teens. I hope you learned something today to both empower and inspire you and your teen. Until next time.
So, if you listen to podcasts or watch YouTube, you've probably heard it 1,000 times before. The plea to subscribe and leave a review or a comment. Well, here we are again. But seriously, the review is especially important to us, as it has a huge impact on our discoverability amongst the zillions of podcasts all competing for your attention. So please consider leaving a review. And heck, we'd really love to hear your feedback. This pilot episode of the EcoParent Podcast Network was made possible with the generous support of Ontario Creates. Thanks for listening.